Water was rising fast, too fast. I saw it before anyone else did. The creek behind my house swelled in minutes, and by noon, the flood was already creeping into the first floors. People were still asleep, unaware that their homes were becoming traps. The sound of splashing woke me by then. It was too late. I grabbed my phone and called HOA, but Karen Greaves, the president, answered with a dismissive tone. "Caleb, stop. It's just a little rain," she said, laughing. "Just a little rain. The streets are flooding." "Karen," I shouted, panic setting in. "It's happening right now," her response. "Nothing more than a cold. You're overreacting." But the water wasn't stopping. People woke to water surging into their homes. They scrambled, lifting whatever they could to higher ground. Some swam across the fast-moving flood. Others ran for the second floor or their roofs. And then I saw it, Karen herself stuck on her roof begging for help. Her, the one who'd ignored every warning. I realized then I wasn't just fighting nature anymore. I was fighting her. Karen Greaves was always the first to speak at HOA meetings, but it wasn't for the right reasons. As president of Silver Hollow's HOA, she wielded power like a sword, ready to cut down anyone who challenged her. To the outside world, she seemed like the perfect suburban leader, polished, confident, and controlling. She had the immaculate house, the manicured lawn, and the charm to match. She walked with her head high, smiling at every neighbor, with the kind of politeness that bordered on condescension. But behind the smile was a woman who valued control above all else, even human safety. Karen's agenda was always clear: maintain the neighborhood's image at any cost. When I first moved into Silver Hollow with my daughter, I had a simple request: fix the drainage system. The streams, ponds, and creeks around our neighborhood had a history of flooding, but nothing had been done to improve the infrastructure. I raised my concerns with HOA, knowing the risk, but Karen, with her authoritative voice and polished demeanor, brushed me off. "Caleb, everything's fine," she said with a smirk when I asked about the flood risks. "We've been monitoring it and we're not in any danger. Relax." She had no intention of acting. To her, the idea of a potential disaster was just an inconvenience, a stain on the perfect picture she was painting of Silver Hollow. Karen had invested too much in making sure everything was pristine, from the front gates to the perfectly aligned mailboxes, to let anything, even a flood, ruin her vision of a spotless neighborhood. But beneath her calm exterior was an obsessive need for control. Karen's true motive was about preserving her status in the neighborhood. She couldn't afford to be wrong to admit there were flaws in the neighborhood she managed so meticulously. To her, the idea of admitting we had a problem with the drainage system wasn't just an issue of public safety. It was an issue of pride. And now, when the floodwaters were already swallowing Silver Hollow, HOAKaren's refusal to listen to the warnings was about to cost her everything. But she hadn't learned her lesson yet. When I saw her trapped on the roof, I knew she was the last person who would ever admit fault. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about stopping the flood. It was about making sure she faced the consequences of her inaction. The rain had started early in the morning, gently but steadily soaking the ground. I had told myself not to make a fuss about it, but there was something off that I couldn't ignore. At first, it was just a thin layer of water on the surface of the creek, but I was keeping a close eye on it. With years of experience living in flood-prone areas, I knew when something didn't feel right. From my window, I could see the channels in the neighborhood rising rapidly. The water level had already reached higher than usual, and something felt wrong. It wasn't the first time I'd seen heavy rains, but this time was different. The weather forecast showed a severe storm approaching, and the water was already threatening to spill over the banks. I knew I had to act fast. I quickly sent an email to the HOA, urging them to inspect the drainage system. I attached photos and notes on the increasing water level. I knew that if the water went unchecked, it wouldn't just cause property damage, it could put everyone's safety at risk. But just a few minutes later, I received a response from Karen Greaves, the HOA president. She was always the first to speak up in HOA meetings, but she usually used her authority to push her agenda, not to address real issues. Karen's response was as predictable as always, dismissive and condescending. "Caleb, don't worry. The drainage system is fine. This rain will pass quickly," she wrote, as if everything was under control. I stared at the screen, my frustration rising. "Fine," I shot back, my voice growing more urgent. "The water is already up to the sidewalk, Karen. This is exactly what I warned you about," she responded coldly. "You're overreacting, Caleb. It's just a little rain. Everything's fine." But it wasn't fine. By the time I realized the gravity of the situation, the flood was already in progress. I rushed to check my yard, and by then, the water had already begun to invade the first floor of my house. It was happening too fast. I grabbed sandbags from the garage and tried to reinforce the doors, but it was clear this wasn't going to be enough. I decided to go to the HOA office to confront Karen. It was raining harder now, and the streets were already starting to flood. I couldn't wait for another email or phone call. This was an emergency. I walked into the HOA building with a stack of documents ready to demand action. Karen, I called as I entered. She looked up from the large table, surprised to see me. Her face showed no concern, just the usual arrogance. "Caleb, what's going on now? Is there another issue with the drainage system?" she asked, her tone dripping with annoyance. "The situation is really bad, Karen. I just checked, and the water is rising quickly. If we don't act now, we're going to have a flood," I said, voice tense. "This isn't something we can ignore anymore." She shrugged, tapping away on her computer. "Relax, Caleb. It's just a little rain. You're making a big deal out of nothing." "Nothing. The streets are flooding, Karen." I almost yelled. "People will lose their homes, their belongings. This is real." She just looked at me, then smirked and continued typing, showing no sign of urgency. "We don't have a problem, Caleb. It'll all clear up in a few hours." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Karen was dismissing a real threat, and she didn't seem to care about the safety of the people who lived here. I turned and left, fuming with anger, but also knowing that time was running out. By the time I got back to my house, the flood had already started. The water had risen to the point where people were panicking. I called a few neighbors to warn them, but many were already too late. Some were frantically trying to move their valuables to higher ground, while others were struggling to get out of their homes. I could hear the fear in their voices. "Help, Caleb. The water's already in my house," came a voice over the phone. The panic was clear. "We can't get out. What should we do?" I rushed to help, but the reality was setting in. The water kept rising, and there was no escaping it. People were beginning to swim through the fast-moving water, trying to get to higher ground on the other side of the street. For some, it was already too late. I watched in disbelief as the flood consumed more of the neighborhood. People were climbing to their second floors or onto their roofs, desperate for help. The situation was escalating faster than I ever imagined. And then I saw her, Karen. She was stuck on her roof, frantically waving for help. It was surreal. The same woman who had ignored every warning I gave, the one who had belittled me for being alarmist, she was now in the same position as the people she had dismissed so easily. At that moment I realized something. This wasn't just about the storm anymore. It wasn't about the water or the damage. It was about holding Karen and the HOA accountable for their negligence. They had ignored the warnings, and now the neighborhood was paying the price. As the water continued to rise, I knew this flood was no coincidence. The signs had been there, and I had warned everyone repeatedly. But now, the truth was becoming undeniable. Silver Hollow's drainage system was a disaster waiting to happen, and the more I dug, the more I realized the extent of the negligence. While I was evacuating, I couldn't help but take a closer look at the situation. I grabbed my phone, pulled up the original community plans I had saved years ago, and started comparing them to what I was seeing in front of me. The reality hit me like a punch in the gut. The flood wasn't just an act of nature, it was a result of deliberate negligence. I had the proof right in front of me. As I looked through the documents, I found a series of meeting minutes from HOA sessions over the past year. They were littered with budget discussions, but the most alarming thing was the repeated mention of fund allocation adjustments for maintenance projects. A red flag immediately went up. What caught my eye, however, was a specific line hidden in one of the emails: delay critical maintenance to drainage systems to prioritize neighborhood beautification. I scrolled through more emails, piecing together the full story. The HOA, led by Karen, had accepted a financial offer from local developers to delay necessary maintenance to the drainage systems in exchange for funds they could use for landscaping and other superficial neighborhood projects. It wasn't just a misstep, it was a deal that had put the entire neighborhood in jeopardy. They had ignored the warnings from engineers and experts because they cared more about maintaining the perfect image than ensuring the safety of their residents. The moment I realized this, a surge of anger filled me. Karen's indifference, her refusal to listen to reason, her insistence on maintaining control at all costs, it all made sense now. The flood was not just an accident, it was the outcome of a system built on corruption, negligence, and greed. I couldn't stay silent anymore. I knew I had to confront the HOA and expose the truth, no matter the consequences. If I didn't act, then this would continue to happen to other people, and I couldn't let that happen. The next day, the water was still too high to safely move around, but I wasn't going to wait. I pulled together the evidence I had gathered, the emails, meeting minutes, budget reports, and photos I had taken of the overflowing drainage systems. It was time to confront Karen and the HOA. I wasn't going to let them pretend everything was fine anymore. I made my way to the community center, where the HOA held its monthly meetings, wading through floodwaters to get there. By the time I arrived, the center was filled with concerned residents, many of whom had already started to repair their homes. Some were sitting on chairs, some standing, all watching the proceedings unfold. Karen sat at the front, her usual smug demeanor in place. She wasn't worried, she never seemed to be. I stood up, cleared my throat, and walked to the front. The room went silent, all eyes turning toward me. "Excuse me, everyone," I started, voice firm but controlled. "I have something important to share." Karen shot me a cold glance, but I wasn't going to back down. The flood that has devastated this neighborhood didn't happen by chance. It happened because the HOA, under Karen's leadership, knowingly delayed critical maintenance to the drainage system to prioritize superficial projects. There was a collective gasp in the room. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Karen's face went pale, but she quickly regained her composure. "You're wrong, Caleb," Karen interrupted, her voice steady, but there was a hint of nervousness in her eyes. "This is an emergency situation, and these kinds of things happen all the time. The HOA has been taking care of this community for years. We've always done our best." "No, Karen," I shot back, not letting her deflect. "I've got the proof. Emails, meeting minutes, and documents showing that the HOA took money from developers to delay essential drainage work. And now look around you. Homes are flooded, people are stranded, and the only thing you care about is your reputation." The room was silent for a moment, but murmurs of agreement began to ripple through the crowd. Some were shaking their heads, others were exchanging glances, clearly processing what I had said. Karen's eyes narrowed as the murmurs grew louder. "I've had enough of this," Karen snapped, standing up abruptly. "You're making wild accusations without any basis. We have a system in place, and we will get through this as a community." But the damage was done. The truth had been exposed. Karen could no longer hide behind her polished facade. I had provided undeniable proof of her negligence, and the community now knew what had happened. As she tried to regain control of the meeting, her attempts fell flat. The room was no longer on her side. The damage to her reputation was done, and I could see the fear creeping into her eyes. "I will not allow this neighborhood to be destroyed because of your mistakes," I said, my voice cutting through the tension in the room. "We deserve better than this, and we will hold those responsible accountable." The next few minutes were a blur. People began speaking up, demanding action, while Karen tried to maintain her authority, but it was clear the room had turned against her. Her walls of control were crumbling, and I wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. As the water continued to rise, I could feel the weight of the disaster pressing down on the entire neighborhood. What had once been a quiet suburban haven was now an unrecognizable wasteland. Streets had turned into rivers, and homes that just days ago had been filled with laughter and family dinners were now flooded to the rooftops. People desperate and disoriented were scrambling to find higher ground. I watched helplessly as cars were swept away, floating down streets like toys caught in a powerful current. Neighbors who had once exchanged polite greetings now stood on their roofs, clinging to chimneys or tree branches, waiting for rescue teams that couldn't arrive fast enough. Some tried to swim across the increasingly violent floodwaters, but the current was too strong, and they were pulled back, fighting to stay afloat. Others managed to climb to second floors or higher, but even those were becoming submerged as the water continued its relentless rise. It was in the middle of this chaos that the full magnitude of the situation hit me. This wasn't just a freak storm, it was the culmination of years of willful neglect. The HOA's failure to act had left us all exposed. I knew that I couldn't let Karen or anyone else get away with this. The damage wasn't just physical, it was systemic, and it went deeper than I could have ever imagined. While people struggled to stay afloat, I couldn't stop myself from investigating further. With the floodwaters still raging outside, I took a deep breath and dug into more of the HOA's records. I had already seen the initial documents, the emails, the meeting minutes, the budget reports, but now I needed to go further. I found more disturbing details buried in the HOA's financial documents, specifically how they had accepted money from developers in exchange for delaying the much-needed upgrades to the drainage system. The deeper I went, the clearer the picture became. I found an email sent by Karen months before the flood, where she discussed with a developer about prioritizing cosmetic upgrades over actual safety measures. The conversation was shockingly casual, as if their primary concern wasn't preventing a disaster, but keeping the neighborhood looking perfect. The email read, "We can't afford major repairs to the drainage system right now. The neighborhood's look is what matters most. We'll delay the infrastructure work for now, focus on beautification projects, and use the developer's funding to cover the costs. We'll revisit it next year." The email sent a chill through me. Next year. As if putting the infrastructure at risk for one more season wasn't enough of a gamble, Karen had literally chosen the appearance of Silver Hollow over the safety of its residents. The decision was clear. The HOA's financial interests were far more important to her than the safety of the people who lived here. The more I pieced together, the angrier I became. Karen had received kickbacks from developers for turning a blind eye to the obvious risk. In return, she had manipulated the budget to cover up the flood threat. It wasn't incompetence, it was deliberate negligence designed to pad HOA's pockets while we were left to face the consequences. The flood, the damage, the lives that were now at risk, it was all a direct result of her actions. And now, as the water poured into homes, the community was suffering because Karen had put her own financial gain ahead of our lives. The truth was staring me in the face, and I knew I had to expose it. But it wasn't just the documents that confirmed my suspicions. I witnessed the consequences firsthand as the flood continued to wreak havoc on the neighborhood. I had to do something more than just expose the truth. The flood had become a visible manifestation of everything that was wrong with the HOA, a microcosm of their complete disregard for what really mattered. As I waded through the knee-deep water, moving from house to house to help evacuate as many people as I could, I realized how badly the system had failed. Homes that should have been protected by proper infrastructure were now underwater, with belongings floating down streets and precious memories lost to the flood. It was clear that this wasn't just about a lack of preparedness, it was about an entire system built on short-term profit, where the safety of the community was a secondary concern. I ran into a few neighbors who were desperately trying to salvage whatever they could. One elderly woman was trying to lift her furniture to the second floor with the help of a few neighbors, but the water was already halfway up the stairs. I tried to offer help, but the sheer volume of water made it nearly impossible to do anything. The scene was chaotic, disorienting, and heartbreaking, and as I watched people struggle to save their homes, I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. The HOA, and especially Karen, had failed us all. They had ignored the warnings, they had delayed critical repairs, and now this was the result. It wasn't until later, when I spoke to one of the rescue workers, that the full scope of the damage became even more clear. "The retention pond, it's gone," the worker told me, shaking his head. That was the only thing holding all this back. If the HOA had fixed the drainage systems earlier, none of this would have happened. You'd think they'd have learned by now. I knew this was no ordinary flood. This was the result of years of neglect and greed. And Karen, she was still holed up in her house, acting as though nothing had happened. I saw her again standing on her roof, looking like she had finally realized the gravity of the situation. But it was too late. I couldn't stay silent anymore. The community deserved to know the truth. I sent the evidence to every local news outlet I could find, making sure the story got out. People had to see that this wasn't just an unfortunate act of nature, it was a preventable disaster caused by a failure to act on warnings and a failure to put people's safety first. As the waters receded and the damage was slowly assessed, the media began picking up the story. Karen couldn't hide behind her polished image anymore. The truth was out, and it was devastating for her. The community's faith in the HOA had been shattered, and it was clear that Karen's financial interests had come at the cost of lives and livelihoods. As the floodwaters receded and the devastation of Silver Hollow became clearer, the truth about the HOA's corruption couldn't be contained any longer. The damage was far-reaching, not just in terms of property lost, but in the broken trust within the community. The truth was out there, and now it was time for the authorities to step in. It didn't take long for the first investigative journalists to arrive in Silver Hollow. They'd been tipped off about the flood's severity, but what they uncovered went much deeper than just a natural disaster. The cameras were rolling as reporters began to interview residents, and the coverage soon snowballed into a full-scale investigation into the HOA's handling, or rather mishandling, of the neighborhood's infrastructure. I had shared all my evidence, emails, budget reports, the developer's kickback agreement, and the blatant disregard for warnings. It was clear that the HOA had been negligent, but I had no idea just how deep the corruption ran. The first major break came when investigative reporters managed to obtain internal HOA documents that had been buried for months, if not years. They found reports showing that maintenance work for the drainage systems had been delayed not just once, but repeatedly over several years. More shockingly, they discovered evidence that the HOA had intentionally hidden these reports, burying any record of the drainage system's failure in order to avoid taking responsibility. The public outcry was swift and unforgiving. Karen, the HOA president, tried to downplay the situation, but it was too late. The community, once placated by her reassuring words, was now angry and demanding accountability. The media attention intensified as the truth about the HOA's negligence became impossible to ignore. When the authorities finally stepped in, it was clear that the investigation wasn't just about the flood damage anymore. It was about corporate malfeasance at the highest levels. The local government, under pressure from the community and the press, launched a formal inquiry into the HOA's practices. The city's legal department began to probe deeper into the financial transactions that had taken place, particularly focusing on the HOA's dealings with the developers. As the investigation continued, more and more damning information came to light. The HOA had not only falsified maintenance records, but they had also manipulated budget reports, intentionally underreporting the need for repairs to their drainage system. They had prioritized unnecessary beautification projects over essential infrastructure repairs, all to protect their financial interests. The money they received from developers wasn't just a kickback, it was part of a much larger scheme to maintain control over the neighborhood while keeping residents in the dark. The authorities began to interview HOA board members, starting with Karen. At first, she remained defiant. In front of cameras and reporters, she denied any wrongdoing, repeating the same lines about routine maintenance and unforeseen circumstances. But under the pressure of the investigation, cracks began to show. Karen's carefully constructed facade of competence was starting to crumble. The pressure on the HOA intensified when the authorities uncovered more incriminating evidence. They found discrepancies in the official HOA documents, showing that Karen had authorized funds to be reallocated to personal accounts. Some of the funds meant for critical infrastructure repairs had been diverted into projects that, while aesthetically pleasing, did nothing to protect the neighborhood from disaster. I remember the moment when the local police arrived at the HOA office. Karen was visibly shaken as law enforcement began seizing records and files. Her usual smug attitude had evaporated, replaced by fear. It wasn't just the media anymore, real formal consequences were closing in. She couldn't bluff her way out of this one. Meanwhile, the community was growing more restless. People were angry, and rightly so. Their homes had been destroyed, their lives uprooted, and all because the HOA had chosen to ignore the very warnings that could have saved them. I attended every public meeting, watching as residents demanded answers. They no longer cared about Karen's excuses. They wanted accountability. They wanted the truth to come to light. One evening during a tense community gathering, a local reporter stood up and asked Karen directly, "How do you respond to the claims that the HOA took money from developers to delay critical infrastructure repairs? How can you justify putting profits over the safety of the residents?" Karen, now visibly sweating, stammered for a moment before trying to brush it off. "Those are accusations, not facts. We were simply making adjustments to fit within the budget." She trailed off, her voice faltering. "Adjustments," a resident shouted from the back of the room. "You call this adjusting? People's homes are ruined, Karen. We trusted you to protect us, and you failed us." The room erupted into applause, the anger and frustration palpable. The tension in the air was thick, and Karen had no response. The truth was out, and it was clear that the HOA, under Karen's leadership, had failed the community in the most unforgivable way. As the days passed, more legal actions were taken. The city's attorney's office issued subpoenas for HOA records, and it became clear that a criminal investigation into the HOA's dealings was imminent. The once untouchable Karen, the leader of the HOA, now found herself at the center of a legal storm. She was facing charges of fraud, neglect of duty, and financial misconduct. The community, for the first time in weeks, felt like it was finally being heard. The pressure on the HOA reached a boiling point. The once strong authority that Karen had held over the neighborhood was evaporating as quickly as the floodwaters had receded. Neighbors who had once been passive now demanded answers and action. The media coverage had reached new heights, and the public's demand for accountability was louder than ever. For Karen, there was no escape. The weight of the evidence, the mounting pressure from authorities, and the fury of the residents all converged. She couldn't hide from the truth any longer. The HOA was about to face consequences, and so was she. The aftermath of the flood left Silver Hollow in tatters. Our once thriving neighborhood was now marked by the deep scars of disaster. Homes were gutted, cars were abandoned in the waterlogged streets, and the haunting smell of mildew permeated the air. But amidst the destruction, something was changing. The community, once divided and passive, had become united in a way I never imagined. This flood, this preventable catastrophe, had forced us all to see the truth. We had been lied to, deceived by the very people we trusted to keep us safe. As the days passed and the floodwaters slowly receded, I knew it wasn't enough to simply expose the HOA's negligence. The legal battle was inevitable. People had lost too much homes, possessions, and their peace of mind for us to just let this go. This was not just about the damage to property. It was about the fundamental breach of trust and safety. It was about holding those responsible accountable, and I was determined to lead the charge. I had spent hours compiling irrefutable evidence, the emails, the meeting minutes, the financial records, showing the deliberate delay in infrastructure repairs, the developer kickbacks, and the falsified reports. All of it painted a clear picture of Karen and the HOA's blatant disregard for the community's safety. But now, it was time to take action. It was time to fight back. At the next community meeting, I stood before a crowd of residents, many of whom were still dealing with the devastation the flood had caused. There were still signs of water damage in their homes, and some were living in temporary shelters. But their faces showed resolve. The fire in their eyes wasn't just from the anger they felt toward the HOA, it was from the shared understanding that we were going to hold them accountable. Together, we would take a stand. I've spent the last few days looking at the records, the evidence I began, my voice firm and clear. And the truth is undeniable. The HOA, led by Karen, deliberately ignored warnings, delayed necessary repairs, and took money from developers to line their pockets at our expense. They put our lives at risk for the sake of appearances, and now we're here to make them answer for it. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. I could see the weight of the disaster on their faces, but I also saw a spark of hope. We were not going to let this go. I proposed that we file a lawsuit against the HOA. We're not just asking for compensation for our damages. We're demanding justice for every single person whose home has been destroyed, for every family that had to flee to their rooftops to escape the rising floodwaters. It's time for us to stand united, and it's time for Karen and the HOA to face the consequences of their actions. The room erupted in applause. For the first time, the community was not just passive. We were taking control of our fate. Neighbors who had been hesitant to get involved now stood alongside me, ready to fight. We were going to hold them accountable, no matter what. As we moved forward, the pressure on Karen and the HOA escalated. The legal team I had assembled was top-notch, and we began to build a rock-solid case. We filed the lawsuit demanding not only compensation for the damages caused by the flood, but also punitive damages for the pain and suffering we had endured. The media, which had already been reporting on the HOA's corruption, now turned their focus to the legal battle. The pressure on the HOA was growing, and they could no longer pretend this was just an isolated incident. But Karen wasn't going down without a fight. She hired a high-powered legal team to defend the HOA, but it was clear that they were on the defensive. The evidence was overwhelming, and there was nowhere for her to hide. Her carefully constructed public image as a responsible community leader was crumbling, and the community was watching, waiting for her to be held accountable. Despite all the evidence, Karen's response was predictably arrogant. She refused to take responsibility for the damage, and instead blamed the storm, claiming it was an unforeseeable event that no one could have prepared for. But no one was buying her excuses anymore. The community had seen the evidence, and we knew the truth. Karen had deliberately ignored the signs of the disaster to protect her own interests, and now she was facing the consequences. The media coverage of the legal battle intensified. Interviews, press conferences, and news reports kept the HOA's negligence front and center in the public eye. Karen's lies were exposed, and the community's anger grew louder. For every hour that passed, the walls around Karen and the HOA's defense began to close in. But then, just as the legal battle reached its boiling point, something unexpected happened. We received word that Karen and the HOA were trying to settle the case out of court. The offer they made was insulting, far below what we were demanding. They offered a lump sum payment to cover a fraction of the damages, hoping to silence the community with money. But the community wasn't fooled. We knew it wasn't about money, it was about justice. We weren't going to let Karen and the HOA off the hook so easily. I called for an emergency meeting of the community. "They're trying to buy us off," I said, holding up the settlement offer. "They think they can throw money at us and make this go away. But we've already seen what happens when we let them buy their way out of responsibility. We won't settle for less than full accountability." The room was silent for a moment before a voice from the back called out, "We need to make them pay for everything. All of it. They put our lives at risk. They should be held accountable for the harm they've caused." The community was in full agreement. We were no longer interested in a quick payout. We wanted justice, and we were going to get it no matter how long it took. Karen and the HOA were now backed into a corner. The evidence against them was irrefutable. The public outrage was undeniable, and the legal battle was intensifying. There was no way out for them anymore. The community had united, and we were ready to take this all the way. As the days went by, the pressure on Karen grew. I knew she was watching the tide turn against her, and for the first time, I saw the cracks in her arrogance. She had no choice but to face the consequences of her actions, and I could feel that the end of this battle was coming soon. But just as the legal team was preparing for the next big court date, a surprising message came through. It was a letter from the HOA's attorneys, a final offer to settle the case. The letter was brief and to the point, but the message was clear. They were willing to negotiate, but only if we agreed to settle immediately. The final battle was about to begin, but I had no doubt that the truth would prevail. The final showdown had arrived. The community center was packed, far more crowded than usual. It was a far cry from the polite gatherings we had once had under Karen's tight control. Now the air was thick with tension. People who had once quietly accepted the HOA's leadership were no longer willing to sit back and ignore what had happened. The storm, both literal and metaphorical, had changed everything. I stood at the front of the room facing Karen and the rest of the HOA board. In front of me was a pile of evidence, emails, financial reports, maintenance logs, and a stack of documents proving the HOA's deliberate negligence. I had carefully organized everything, making sure each piece was irrefutable. The press was there, the cameras rolling, and a sense of anticipation hung in the air. I had promised the community I would expose the truth, and I wasn't about to let them down. "Karen," I began, my voice steady but filled with resolve. "You've lied to us for far too long. You ignored our warnings, you took money from developers, and you put our homes at risk. But today, the truth will be revealed." I slid the first document onto the table, an email chain between Karen and a developer where she explicitly stated that they would delay critical infrastructure repairs in exchange for a financial arrangement. The room fell silent as I let the evidence speak for itself. Karen, visibly flustered, shifted in her seat. She tried to maintain her composure, but I could see the cracks starting to form in her veneer of control. She opened her mouth to speak, but I didn't let her. "I've got more." I continued, laying out more evidence documents, showing that the HOA had misallocated funds meant for necessary repairs to instead fund beautification projects and unnecessary expenditures. This isn't just a failure to act. This is manipulation. This is fraud. Karen tried to interrupt, standing up and raising her hand, but the room wasn't on her side anymore. A few residents spoke up, their voices trembling with anger, but also with the certainty that they were finally being heard. "Enough, Karen," one neighbor shouted. "You promised us safety, and you failed us." Another resident joined in, her voice filled with disbelief. "You put all of us in danger for your own profit. How could you do that?" Karen's face turned pale, and her usual arrogance was gone. She opened her mouth again, but the words caught in her throat. The pressure was mounting, and she could feel the tide turning against her. "This is nonsense," Karen finally blurted out, trying to regain control. "You all are overreacting. The HOA has always acted in good faith. These accusations, these documents are fabricated." But the community wasn't buying it. The evidence was too overwhelming. The documents were real, and the truth was undeniable. Slowly, one by one, the residents began to stand, their eyes fixed on Karen. They weren't just agreeing with me. They were finally seeing the truth for themselves. The anger, frustration, and betrayal that had been simmering beneath the surface now exploded into open defiance. "We've had enough, Karen," someone shouted from the back. "This is the last straw," Karen faltered, and I could see her grasping for something, anything to hold on to. She was losing control, and she knew it. The more she tried to deflect, the worse it became for her. The more I presented, the less she could hide behind her lies. "We trusted you to keep us safe, and you sold us out," I said, looking directly at her. "This isn't about mismanagement. This is about greed and corruption. You and the board sold us out to developers, and now we all suffer the consequences." The room was buzzing now, the community completely behind me. It wasn't just my voice anymore. It was the voice of everyone who had been hurt by the HOA's greed, everyone who had suffered because of Karen's lies. "I did what was best for this community." Karen tried again, but it was too late. Her words were hollow, and her defense had already crumbled. A voice from the back shouted, "You didn't do what was best. You did what was best for you." Karen's face flushed with anger, but she had no way to defend herself. The community wasn't just demanding answers. Now, they were demanding accountability. The flood had been the final straw, but the real damage had been done long before the storm hit, and Karen couldn't run from the truth anymore. As I looked around the room, I could see the shift. The residents who had once been afraid to speak out now stood united, ready to fight. They were done being manipulated. The tide had turned, and it wasn't just about this meeting, it was about everything that came next. Karen and the HOA board had finally been exposed for who they truly were: corrupt, self-serving, and negligent, and they couldn't escape that truth. With the evidence in front of everyone, there was no more room for denial. The fight wasn't over, but the first and most important battle had been won. We had taken back control of our community. The moment the documents were released, everything changed. I had carefully compiled a mountain of evidence, but this was the tipping point. I knew the stakes had escalated, but as I hit send on that final email, I couldn't help but feel a sense of grim satisfaction. The truth wrapped in concrete evidence was finally out there. I sent the documents directly to the local authorities, environmental agencies, and the media. With one action, the game had shifted. The evidence I released was nothing short of explosive. First, I shared internal HOA communications, showing that Karen and the board had long been aware of the risks. There were meeting minutes from several years ago where engineers had flagged the drainage system as a potential disaster waiting to happen. But instead of addressing it, the HOA under Karen's direction buried the reports. Instead of making repairs, they made excuses, pushing forward with cosmetic projects that served their interests rather than the community's safety. Among the documents was a detailed environmental report, one that had been tucked away in the HOA's files for far too long. It outlined the specific dangers posed by the retention pond, which had not been reinforced as recommended by engineers. The report showed clear indications that the pond was at risk of overflowing due to years of neglect, and yet Karen and the board ignored it. Instead of taking the necessary actions to ensure the neighborhood's safety, they chose to put their financial interests first. I also included evidence of the developer's involvement documents showing financial transactions where money was funneled into the HOA's budget under the guise of development fees. But in reality, these payments were used to delay maintenance. There was no longer any doubt Karen and the HOA had been aware of the risk and had, with full knowledge, done nothing to prevent it. The reaction was immediate. Authorities, prompted by the flood of new evidence, sprang into action. Investigators from the city government and environmental agencies descended on the HOA offices. They began combing through the records I had sent, cross-referencing documents and questioning board members. For the first time, the HOA could no longer escape the truth. No spin, no excuses. The weight of the evidence left them no room to maneuver. As the authorities initiated their investigation, the community began to feel the full force of the betrayal. Up until this point, many had suspected that the HOA was at fault, but now with the irrefutable proof laid bare, the truth hit home. People were angry, furious even. The realization that Karen and the HOA had knowingly allowed their homes and lives to be put at risk for financial gain struck a chord. They were not just victims of a natural disaster. They were victims of betrayal by the very people they had trusted. I watched as neighbors gathered in small groups, talking in hushed voices, some holding copies of the documents I had sent out. The community that had once been passive, uncertain about confronting the HOA, was now waking up. Residents who had previously shrugged off concerns, dismissing them as paranoia, now felt the weight of the truth. The HOA had known. They had the power to act, and they chose not to. At the community center, the atmosphere had completely shifted. The quiet complacency that had once defined Silver Hollow had been replaced with outrage. Karen's grip on the neighborhood, which had always seemed so ironclad, was beginning to slip. She had controlled the narrative for years, using fear, intimidation, and a carefully crafted image of leadership to keep the community in line. But now, with the truth exposed, that narrative had been shattered. Karen tried to maintain her composure, but it was clear to everyone that her facade was cracking. At the next HOA meeting, I stood up and watched as she avoided eye contact with everyone in the room. She had no defense left, and even her most loyal supporters in the board could no longer justify her actions. The community was turning on her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The once secure grip the HOA had on Silver Hollow had crumbled. The weight of the evidence was undeniable, and the floodwaters of truth were sweeping away the lies and the corruption. Now it was no longer just about the flood. It was about something far bigger: accountability. And the community, finally united, was demanding it. The floodwaters had barely receded when the true damage began to reveal itself, not just to homes and properties, but to the very structure of Silver Hollow itself. The HOA, once an imposing, unshakable institution, was in complete collapse. The community's rage, now directed at Karen and her board, had reached a boiling point. Their betrayal had been exposed, and there was no way to escape the truth. At the next HOA meeting, Karen was visibly shaken. The confident, polished figure who had once led with authority was now a shell of her former self, her face drawn with exhaustion and fear. The board members who had stood by her in the past were no longer able to defend her. They had seen the evidence, heard the public outcry, and they knew it was over. Karen's empire was crumbling piece by piece, and she couldn't hold it together any longer. In a tense, heated meeting with a room full of angry residents watching, Karen made her first concession. She announced that she and the other board members would step down, but the damage had already been done. The community had seen the truth, and their trust in the HOA was gone. The resignation was a formal admission of guilt, and it sent a clear message to everyone the board had failed, and they were no longer in control. Karen's departure was met with a mix of relief and anger. People shouted, some cheering, others just shaking their heads in disbelief at how it had all gone so far. She had let it all spiral out of control for years, and now the consequences were impossible to ignore. But the community wasn't done. We had fought for accountability, and now we needed to rebuild not just our homes, but the very fabric of our neighborhood. The resignation of the board members didn't immediately solve the issues that had been caused by the flood, but it was a start. For the first time in a long time, Silver Hollow had control of its future. The first step toward recovery was taking down the HOA piece by piece. The community came together, and we agreed to dissolve the HOA and rebuild our neighborhood from the ground up, this time with transparency, fairness, and accountability at its core. We were determined to never let the mistakes of the past repeat. With the HOA officially dismantled, the neighborhood formed a new resident-led council. The goal was clear: to ensure that no one could ever again exploit Silver Hollow for personal gain. We set out to rebuild our homes, starting with a focus on the infrastructure that had failed us so badly. Together, we worked on a new drainage system, using the lessons from our painful experience to ensure we never faced the same kind of devastation again. It wasn't easy, and the scars of the flood would remain for years to come, but the community stood united. Neighbors who had once been strangers now worked side by side, helping one another rebuild not just the homes, but the trust that had been shattered. We were no longer just a collection of houses on a street. We were a community bound together by shared hardship and the resolve to create something better. And as we began to rebuild, it wasn't just the physical structures that were being repaired. Our sense of community, fractured for so long by the selfishness of the HOA, was being restored. We had come through the storm together, and now we would build something stronger and more resilient. Standing there amidst the rebuilding, I couldn't help but feel victorious, not just for my family, but for every single person in Silver Hollow. We had taken back control. The HOA's hold over us had been broken. The damage they caused couldn't be fully undone, but we had made sure that they would never have the power to harm us again. In the end, it wasn't about the property damage or the monetary compensation. It was about the fact that we, the people of Silver Hollow, had reclaimed our neighborhood. We had fought for accountability, we had stood up to corruption, and we had rebuilt a community stronger than it had ever been before. The days following the collapse of the HOA were filled with a quiet sense of unity that I hadn't felt before. People who had once kept to themselves were now working together hand in hand to rebuild Silver Hollow. It was no longer just about restoring homes, it was about rebuilding trust, connection, and the spirit of a community that had been fractured by greed and neglect. As I watched my neighbors working side by side, whether it was clearing debris, fixing fences, or planting new trees, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride. We had taken control of our own fate, and we were stronger for it. No longer were we bound by the rules of an HOA that had never cared about us. We were finally free to shape our own future. But even in this moment of collective triumph, the pain of the past lingered. The damage done by the HOA, the lives disrupted, and the homes lost, those scars wouldn't vanish overnight. While I was proud of the resilience of Silver Hollow, I couldn't forget what had been taken from us. The battle had been won, but the memories of the flood and the HOA's betrayal would stay with us for years to come. The legal consequences for the HOA were swift and severe. With the overwhelming evidence against them, the HOA was hit with millions of dollars in damages. Karen and the other board members, once untouchable, were now facing personal and financial ruin. The courts ruled in favor of the residents, and Karen, along with her board members, was forced to compensate everyone affected by the flood. The settlement was massive, a reflection of the scale of the damage caused by their negligence. Residents received compensation for property damage, recovery costs, and the emotional toll the disaster had taken on their lives. While no amount of money could undo the harm done, it was a significant step toward holding the HOA accountable. The financial penalties placed on the HOA sent a clear message to others who might have thought they could escape responsibility for their actions. Silver Hollow's community was no longer a place where corrupt leaders could manipulate and ignore the people they were supposed to serve. The HOA was dismantled, its leaders held responsible, and the residents were finally given the justice they deserved. Karma, it seemed, had come full circle for the HOA and its corrupt leaders. With the settlement money and the HOA dismantled, the community of Silver Hollow knew they could never go back to the way things were. The residents, united by the flood's aftermath, decided to form a new resident council. This council would be completely transparent, with all decisions made openly under the watchful eyes of everyone who lived here. There would be no more hiding behind closed doors, no more unchecked power. Every voice would matter. As the vote to create the new council passed, a sense of pride and accomplishment washed over me. The community that had once been divided, fearful of the HOA's control, was now stronger than ever. Silver Hollow was a neighborhood reborn, built on trust, transparency, and unity. We weren't just repairing homes anymore. We were rebuilding something far more important, our connection to each other. I stood with my neighbors as we looked over the neighborhood, now free from the shadow of the HOA. The flood hadn't just washed away our homes, it had washed away the lies, the manipulation, and the indifference. The future felt brighter, filled with hope and promise. For the first time, we were in charge of our own destiny, and nothing, not even the past, could take that away. Looking back, the win wasn't what mattered most. It wasn't the settlement, the lawsuit, or even the resignation of the HOA board. What mattered was how we got there. We stood up for what was right, but we did it the right way through the legal process, not through anger or rash decisions. Without the law on our side, without the evidence backing us, it could have all gone terribly differently. Anger can fuel action, but it's the law that brings true change. Standing up legally like we did doesn't mean giving in to rage or fighting fire with fire. It means keeping your cool, sticking to the facts, and trusting in a system that, though flawed, can deliver justice when used properly. Emotions can cloud judgment. It's important to remember that evidence and due process are what made the difference, not anger, not revenge. To anyone watching, take it from someone who's been through it, document everything. Keep records. If something doesn't feel right, look into it, check public filings, get the facts. And when it's clear something bigger is at play, don't hesitate to bring in an attorney or authorities. This isn't about playing hero, it's about ensuring you have the right tools to take the right steps. Communities stay strong when people respect the law. The HOA's power only existed because they weren't being held accountable. That power disappeared when we chose to stand together grounded in the truth. Just like the lake, calm and steady, we rebuilt from the ground up, not with anger, but with the quiet strength of knowing what's right.